Bom dia a todos e a todas. Estou aguardando apenas o Søren aparecer também aqui na minha tela. Estou vendo já, tudo certo? Esse painel vai ser em inglês, então eu vou trocar agora para língua inglesa. Thank you all for being here, for the organizers for putting this together. I think this is a very important event for the CCT Brazilian community. Thank you all for attending this panel called Establishing a Dialogue with Science. We're delighted to have and to host here Professor Søren Askegaard, who will be very soon speaking to us from Denmark. Before I hand it over to Søren, I just have one short FGV's official statement to disclaim. So it goes like this. All statements expressed by Fundação Getúlio Vargas employees and guests in our online events and broadcasts exclusively represent their opinions and not necessarily FGV's institutional position. We also reiterate that everyone present here agreed to participate in this event of their own free will, and they consented to be recorded in this broadcast, which will be posted later on FGV official channels. This goes to participants now. Please submit your questions through our Q&A. And please feel free to submit them in Portuguese if you wish, and we'll try to translate it accordingly. So about Søren now, and I think Søren requires no introduction, but please let me briefly say that based on my short experience with him, personally, Søren is a kind, humble, and generous human being, or should I say human becoming? As you mentioned in your paper, as you cited Tim Ingold, I had a chance to meet you, Søren, more closely last year during the Weekend of Classics in Odense in Denmark. And I remember at the end of the workshop, after we discussed all the classic authors on sociology and anthropology, among other disciplines. And after a delight moment when we were dancing to the sound of mob, Søren said to a small group of PhD students, and I was in this circle with these other PhD students, and you said something like, guys, go live your lives. That is what really matters, because at the end, you're not going to regret not publishing a paper or something. So this kind of meaningful encounters and exchanges were really part of this event last year. So I think it was very good to be there. So thank you, Søren, for that. But besides being a brilliant person, you're also a brilliant scholar. So let me introduce you professionally, let's say. Søren is a professor at the Department of Marketing and Management at the University of Southern Denmark, SDU. He is the founder and current member of the SDU's research unit called Consumption, Culture, and Commerce, CCC. He is also a board member and current president of the Consumer Culture Theory Consortium. And he is the chair of business and social sciences at the Danish Institute for Advanced Study. Søren researches new cuisine and taste regimes, moralization, consumer empowerment in medical health service, and sustainability, among other topics. And talking about sustainability, today's talk, Professor Søren is here to exchange with us his thoughts on his recently published article in the French journal called Recherche et Application en Marketing, titled Putting the Anthropos Back in Consumer Research, Beyond Reductionisms. Søren, it's a great pleasure to have you with us. Thanks for being here, despite the fact that you are now in a sick leave. But thank you again. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for this humbling introduction, Jannsen. I shall do my best to live up to it. I hope the sound is good in the Brazilian end. And
good.
Yes, okay, so I will see if I can start screen sharing. I'm so happy to be able to be with you today. As Jannsen said, I'm actually on sick leave, so I'm not allowed to work. But speaking to the Brazilian CCT community is not work. That's pleasure. And so consider that as a linking back to my remarks in the PhD seminar that Jannsen was talking about. It was not exactly an encouragement to not publish papers, but only to publish those papers that are not considered work, but that are considered actual curiosity, insights, research that you cannot not do, rather than fall into the trap of productivism, which neoliberal university management imposes on researchers throughout the world. So publish as much as you can, but do it with pleasure. I suppose that is my call here. Okay, so I will see if I can share this. I should go back one slide if I can do that. Yes, is it good? I hope so.
All good.
So yes, as Jannsen kindly introduced, I'm going to talk a little bit about some highlights from this paper that also exists in an English language version that is available either through the RAM website, or if you write an email directly to me, to the extent that you cannot get access or you cannot find it, that's also fine. But I'm also going to extend a few things and a few points, in particular in terms of ethics and some of the consequences that I hope will come out of this paper, because it's one of those papers that I have written for pleasure, and because I really wanted to share these thoughts, and they are preliminary thoughts. They are sort of an attempt to open a new research field for myself, but hopefully also for others, because the ambition is no less than trying to produce a certain manifesto for CCT, an encouragement, a call for new streams of research that are additional. They should not necessarily replace what we do in the CCT community, but I hope to be able to invite people to do something also oriented towards a dialogue with science, and in particular in a dialogue with biology, as I should try to specify a little bit later. This is something that I have thrown myself into, and in the years to come, I hope to be able to write a few more papers that will develop various aspects of this, alone or together with other interested parts, like my good friend and colleague Eric Arnold, who is on to some of the similar thoughts, and we'll get back to that in due time. So the ambition is to try to set set a new stream of research in motion based on a manifesto for a dialogue with biology and with science, more generally speaking. This is not least to remedy an impression that I've had throughout the years, that whenever something biological was introduced or published, evolutionary theory in JCR, there's a number of colleagues who have published quite impactful evolutionary psychology papers and various sort of genetic and other biological approaches. The tendency of my wonderful friends and colleagues in CCT has been to meet this kind of research with a complete abjuration. It's like, take it away. This is a very bad and very poor way of explaining human behavior, and most often, in fact, they are quite right. But as time has passed, I have come to be a little less certain that this abjuration, this sort of turning our back on most anything biological, is actually preventing us from engaging in very, very important developments that take place in the fields of notably anthropology, but also in parts of sociology, etc. These are not necessarily mainstream movements within those disciplines, but I think that they are very important, and I think that we will miss the boat if we are not also engaging in this dialogue. So this is an invitation to engage in such a dialogue and not to fear the biology teacher. It's also an epistemological attempt to try to avoid that our dearly and beloved social constructivist epistemology and ontology becomes social determinism. And sometimes in the dialogues about, for example, something that I refer to in the paper, the dialogues about how female children are learning to or not learning to have reverence for particular kinds of employments and career paths, seem to indicate that whenever somebody says, well, maybe men and women are just a tad different in their orientation towards the social world, again, this abjuration comes into play. And while I shall in no way be a proponent of biological gender determinism, that's far from my agenda. I think that, again, this fear of engaging in a serious dialogue is preventing us from important insights. So in a sense, there is a certain, and of course, old bearded men are not in vogue these days, and for very good reasons. But there is a, as I said initially, there's a good reason why we have this abjuration. It's because Darwinian adaptation has been pretty dominant in some parts of the marketing and consumer research field. And we have witnessed a marketing success of not least evolutionary psychology, which is both deceptively simple because the explanatory framework is very easy to understand. Human traits survive because they help us adapt better to the challenges we meet on our environments. And so the cultural and the various human features can be explained by an adaptationist logic. But as I argue, and as more informed spirits within biology can also inform us, such a reductionist evolutionary psychology is not just deceptively simple, but also simply deceptive, that we are experiencing also in the marketing and consumer research field what I call a pandemic, not of COVID-19, but of Darwinitis vulgarensis. So my call here is to be aware of this pandemic and to be very skeptical and critical about it. But also to realize that what my first point on this slide underlines, that isolating the notion of culture from the mere fact that it always exists in and of a biological world is another intolerable reductionism. And since I consider one reductionism to not be better than any other reductionism, I'll come back to that in a little while, I am forced to try to save ourselves from that particular reductionism. In other words, to engage in a kind of separating the wheat from the chaff process. So to conclude this sort of introductory part of my short lecture here, a critical attitudes towards the plethora of simple adaptationist and genetic reductionist frameworks of explanation of consumer and marketplace behavior is not in and by itself a reason for neglecting biology, which represents so much more and so much else than such primitive, let me just put it that way, adaptationist logic. Because on the one hand, as Rose and Rose have pointed out, reductionist evolutionism and the simple adaptationist logic is an insult to Darwin. That is one of the ways in which Darwin, just like Marx, has been simplified and abused by ideologizing and ideologized followers well into the 20th and 21st century. But on the other hand, abjuration of our biology altogether is an insult to our existence, since we do exist both culturally and biologically. Indeed, this is a key point of not my argument, although I repeat it several times in the paper, but the argument of a number of scholars that I lean on here. This distinction between biology and culture is meaningless in the first place. We have to go beyond the nature-culture dichotomy, as argued by much greater spirits than myself. And here I just mentioned three of my main sources in my own reflections, namely Edgar Morin's work, which dates back 50 years, Philippe Descolas' groundbreaking ontological reflections on the nature-culture relationships, and Tim Ingold and his colleagues call for a biosocial understanding of anthropological phenomena. So these are all sources you can look up in the paper. I will not go into a more specific presentation of them, but still sort of highlight a few key insights, maybe mainly by Morin, because Morin is somebody who dates back 50 years, but at least in the European scholarly environment, I don't know how it is in Brazil, because Morin has always been very much loved by Latin American universities and Latin America academic environments. But outside France, he's a little bit, and even in France, he's like a wise old man, still alive in his now soon to be 101 years, but not a central reference in French mainstream sociology or anthropology. So I'd like to go back to the key argument that he presented already in his 1973 book and precursor to his major work, La Méthode, the lost paradigm, human nature, le paradigme perdu, la nature humaine in the original French language, where he argues for a non-reductionist, natural human cultural being that goes beyond the human-animal dichotomy. He reinserts the human being as an animal in the earthly natural environment without falling back into some kind of anthropocentric exceptionalism or humanist elevation of the human being as a species that is qualitatively different from the rest of nature. He underlines that the embeddedness of the human being in the natural environment is a cultural phenomena, insofar as without culture, we would never have survived as a species. We are, in other words, as he expresses here in French, a cultural being by nature because we are natural beings by culture. So excluding one from the other or separating them can at best be a mutilating analytical approach, and we should try to avoid that. In his book, The Lost Paradigm, he goes to great length and a number of cultural anthropological and biological anthropological references to analyze how interplays between our genetic system, our cerebral system, our engagement and interaction with our respective ecosystems, the development of our second nature, which he calls the society, the cultural, institutional environments and practices that we build, and how all of these form together in a complex interplay human cultural praxis. So we cannot reduce cultural praxis, that is also marketing practice, consumption practice, etc., to be an outcome of one of these cornerstones. The four cornerstones must always inevitably be taken into consideration in order to understand human praxis. So already here we can see a reluctance to give priority to social constructivism over genetic impacts or the functioning of our neurological system, etc., etc. These things must be considered in their complex interplay together with the Umwelt, as the biologist Uexküll calls it, the ecosystem that we live and survive in. So Morand's biosociality refuses to make a separation between our individual being, our neurosystem, our cerebral and genetic heritage, our biological capacities and incapacities, our strengths and weaknesses as a species, and the societal constitution of humanness, of humanity, and our anthropological, cultural, and institutional surroundings that we have built in a variety of ways, a tremendous variety of ways, although, of course, late modernity and globalization processes have reduced some of that variety and at least introduced a lot of interplay and interaction between various forms of society over the millennia that the human being has evolved as a species. So this is a quest for a biosocial understanding, not just of human capacities in the positive sense. And here is where Morand differs a little bit from some of the wonderful ideas from another stream of thought that I don't go much into in the paper, but I could have mentioned. For example, Joseph Henrich's argument for cultural evolutionism in The Secret of Our Success, that the cultural second nature is the source of our survival and the driver of human evolution. That, of course, Morand can agree to. But what Morand adds to this is a reflection on the fact that cultural evolution and cultural creations are not just a force, but they also produce a number of weaknesses, of seductions and aberrations, and creates a particular human nature, not just of cultural splendor, but also of cultural madness, a human nature of sapiens demens. I'll come back to what he means by that, but just to underline that in order to grasp this and in order to understand human behavior in all its totality, we should refrain from speaking about the physical planet, the environment in which we unfold our practices, the biosphere, the living organisms that are inside and outside us, and a particular humanity that takes place mainly maybe in the brain, maybe mainly in our cultural practices and orientations. But we must think of these elements as a complex totality of physis, of bios, and of anthropos. And this complex totality is not just, as I said for Morand, a benevolent foundation for good things and cultural evolution towards higher order social and cultural forms of being in the history of humanity, but also the source of some of our worst sides. So that is why he is forced to think of the human species not just as the most clever construction in the history of so-called nature, quote unquote, bracket on bracket, but also one of the most failing and aberrational beings. As he argues in Le Paradigme Perdu. Now the true face of the human being appears from its hiding behind the reassuring and soothing concept of sapience. It's a being with an intense and unstable, affectionate life, who smiles, laughs, cries, is frightened and neurotic, a happy, drugged, ecstatic, violent, furious, loving being, invaded by the imaginary, who knows death but cannot believe in it, who creates myth and magic, possessed by spirits and gods, nourished by illusions and chimera, a subjective being whose relationship to the objective world is always uncertain, subject to error and disorder. And since we by madness refer to the constellation of illusion, excess, instability, oscillation between real and unreal, mixing up the subjective and the objective, error and disorder, then we are forced to consider Homo sapiens as Homo demens. And I think what Morin describes here very well describes also the subject that we are, or at least that we should be interested in as CCT scholars. Now, Morin wrote this 50 years ago. 40 years later, these thoughts are echoed in contemporary anthropology, where anthropological colleagues like Tim Ingold, Gisli Paulsson, and others argue for human life not as a particular anthropocentric constitution of particular cultural being, as cultural anthropology traditionally has portrayed it, but as a biosocial becoming, a being that is in constant formation, culturally as well as biologically. And they refer to current insights from non-reductionist biological and biosocial research, for example, into the role of epigenetics, the role of social environment on genetic turn-offs and turn-ons in our biological constitution as individuals, and multiple inherence theory as examples of this biosocial becoming. So as Paulsson, one of the main proponents of this movement in anthropology, says, in fact, no longer can we defend a radical separation between cultural and biological anthropology. This separation, which has established itself as a pretty tight dichotomy between two types of anthropology over the last 5 to 8 decades, that is, since a considerable amount of time, seems today increasingly theoretically indefensible, as demonstrated, for example, by Donna Haraway's post-humanist critique of anthropocentrism, of interspecies relationship, or Anna Tsing's wonderful work on the intersection of culture and nature in the natural marketplace of the Matsutake mushrooms in her wonderful treatise, The Mushroom at the End of the World. It also reflects Philippe Descolas' groundbreaking analysis of competing ontologies, globally speaking, when it comes to consideration of the relationship between nature and culture. And in fact, if we consider his later work, his follow-up works to the 2005 groundbreaking book, it's obvious that this is the starting point for a fundamental critique of the naturalist ontology that has dominated the Western world and the Western thinking for at least 2 centuries, and possibly even 3, 4, a little bit more, to the extent that we must start to consider different types of ontologies if we are to reinsert, as he talks about it in this book, if we are to reinsert the anthropos exactly where it belongs at the juncture of biological and cognitive data. Luckily, these movements are not alone. If we look to the biological side, we will encounter a welcoming hand from non-reductionist biology. And I shall just give one short example here, the emergence of biosemiotics as a counter narrative to the genetic adaptationist logic of explaining life and its survival as a principle. Biosemiotics basically understands life as a semiosis, a processing of signs. Life is distinguished by the fact that there are exchange of information and interpretation, because the information part, I suppose, all biologists would subscribe to. But the important thing here is that from a biosemiotic perspective, you abandon the sort of the mechanic information concept and introduces a semiotic information concept that includes interpretation and therefore an element of uncertainty, of probabilism, of ambivalence and ambiguity, as opposed to the mechanistic information concept that prevails in standard biology. And it's important for Jesper Hofmeyr, who sadly passed away a few years ago, but was one of the main proponents of a biosemiotic approach, that when we talk about biosemiotics, it's not another mysterious vitalist force. This is a highly objectivist, in a certain sense, standard semiotic scientific approach based on Persian semiotics, the Persian triangular model of the sign, including the interpretant, which is, of course, an important challenge to the mechanistic information concept. Jakob von Uexküll's notion of Umwelt, that is the interactivity between all species and their environmental constitution, as we in contemporary terms theorize it, for example, through epigenetics, and Gregory Bateson's theory of communication. So no mysterious forces at stake here. This is all scientific in the best sense of the word. So the argument from biosemiotics is, in very short, that the emergence of semiosis in nature corresponds or coincides with, maybe anticipates, because there may be mixed forms in the history of the emergence of life that we don't know about. So to be cautious and not to draw too fast conclusions, they also add the word anticipate. The emergence of living cells. That is, in other words, life is defined by the exchange of information, which also means that notions such as interacting with the environment, a certain degree of understanding, a certain degree of interpretation, a certain degree, even a very, very small degree of subjectivity is found in all living beings, even the one-celled amoeba. The one-celled amoeba, from a biosemiotic perspective, is, in order to repeat Edgar Morin's arguments from 50 years ago, it is a Heideggerian Dasein. It exists as a particular entity with a particular format of interactivity based on exchange processes with the surrounding world, and hence a particular degree very, very tiny degree of subjectivity, right? It's a poor little Dasein, as Morin says, but a Dasein nevertheless. This also means that it is meaningful to understand cultural evolution, as also theorized by Joseph Heinrich, that I referred to before, as a natural history of science. But a natural history of science that does not only focus, as cultural evolutionism tends to do, on the human history, but also on our interdependence with our embeddedness in what we could call the horizontal aspect of semiosis, the ontogeny of all organisms in the plant and animal communication that is so much in vogue in biological, zoological, botanical research these days, in the inner sign functions of the immune and nervous systems, et cetera, that epigenetic research and genetic research is also pointing out. In other words, biosemiotics is a reinsertion of our own cultural history in a generalized natural history of science, where semiotics of cognition and language is only one specific and one, how you say, gradual transition from a variety of other species that we share this planet with to towards the humanity and our natural cultural constitution as we know it today. So this is another process philosophy, and I believe an obvious invitation to dialogue that I hope to be able to follow up on in a forthcoming paper. So these are some of the backgrounds, both from anthropology, from Morin's 50 years old anthropo-epistemological reflections, and from biology, that I draw upon to conclude and to propose that we engage in this invitation to dialogue. This is not just for intellectual curiosity. I would like to conclude with some reflections that go beyond sort of the mere academic intellectual curiosity of transdisciplinarity and what we might draw from that. Because I would like to conclude with Descola in one of his later works, that exactly an insight and work that build on such a intertwined relationship, a uniformity of humanity and nature, has to be, will be paradigmatic for discussing and producing solution to the key problems of the 21st century. As Descola points out, climate change, the erosion of biodiversity, the multiplication of transgenic organisms, the exhaustion of fossil fuels, the pollution of fragile environments and of large urban centers, the accelerating disappearance of tropical forests, all have become an issue of public debate at the global scale and fuel the disquiet of numerous inhabitants. Needless to say, all of these problems are embedded in particular ways in which we treat our human relationship to nature and our human relationship to production and consumption processes. Because if we extend Descola's reflections to our own CCT world, we will see how, and we will gradually discover how the consumption intersections point us in the direction of the biosocial constitution of body and technology, the biosocial constitution of gender, the biosocial constitution of even our genetic inner mechanisms, the biosocial constitution of medicine, which is something that I have also investigated a little bit together with my wonderful colleague, Anna Schneider-Kamp, the biosociality of aesthetics, and the biosociality of sharing, of community formation, some of the platform for these solutions that Escola was pointing to. In short, exploring the biosocial constitution of consumer culture. So where does that leave us? A few slides for conclusion, and then I shall stop talking because you must be tired of listening to me. This, on the one hand, does not mean that we can do away with anthropocentrism. We have to recognize that anthropocentrism, our perspective on the world, is inevitable, that we cannot learn to see the world from other species' perspectives. But what we can learn is to get beyond the idea that our perspective, our needs, our insertion in the world has a particular privilege. In other words, we have to realize the simultaneous recognition of an inevitable anthropocentrism, but also the need to get beyond it and insert ourselves as individuals and species in an ecosystem or sets of ecosystems of signs of symbiosis and interdependencies. This is in a macro perspective. We look at ourselves as intersecting bodies, as individuals, and understand ourselves no longer as individuals, which is just like Homo sapiens, something that hides much more than it reveals. An understanding of ourselves, as Morin would call it, an unitas multiplex, an intersection of multiple bodies, a microbial ecosystem. In fact, other species make up approximately half or so of our bodily cellular mass, and we can only survive as individuals due to this microbial ecosystem. The sign systems of our internal communication processes, hormonal, neuronal, etc., and the consequences of these complex systems of communication and interactivity for our social and personal being and our social and personal well-being. This also calls for, therefore, a number of ethical reflections. Based on which principles do we investigate, do we approach such a human species reinserted in a natural cultural world? So I've tried to play a little bit with Morin's triangle of individual, society, and species. And in English, we have the good luck that species is the same word in singular as Morin used it, because he was referring particularly to how the human species is formed. But we have just concluded that the human species is in and by itself a unitas multiplex of a lot of species inside ourselves and in networks of interactions that constitute our life conditions and, in fact, our survival as living entities, as living individuals. So in order to understand and constitute ethical approaches to these relationships between individual, between society, and between species, we must refer to democratic inclusion and reciprocal check between individual and society. Democratic societies, democratic organizations are far from perfect, but as I think it was Winston Churchill said, it's the least malfunctioning political organization that we have. And it's the least malfunctioning way of instituting a reciprocal check between societal dominance and individual runaway freedom, that is chaos and social dissolving processes. We have no better system than democratic inclusion and reciprocal check. Insofar as the relationship between individual and the species concerns, we must consider ourselves as inserted in processes of global solidarity. When it comes to our own species, we cannot obviously have ranking of values of different members of the human species depending on skin color, gender, income, etc., etc. Global solidarity means equal valorization of all human beings. But if we extend the species notion to all kinds of species, then it means that we must also think about how we as individuals set marks in our daily interactivity with other kinds of species, although we cannot not put ourselves first, because that is also part of kind of an individual sort of framework of establishing a survivalist scheme. We must tread carefully and stop sort of devalorizing other species, reducing them to means to human ends, which of course modern capitalistic industrial productivism has done with just so many animals in the global animal protein, animal husbandry industries. So that points to the relationship between our societies and its species in general, in plural, the ethics of animal welfare, the responsibilization of the human species in an era of the Anthropocene, and the responsibilization of ourselves in relation to those ecosystemic disaster scenarios that, for example, Descola was pointing out in the quote I gave. So, and now I'm really stopping. My invitation to this dialogue for CCT is, as I see it, also a response and an invitation to engage with what Bruno Latour called the urgent need for getting down to earth, for finding a different path for modernity. It's an invitation to be part of and not to exclude ourselves from a forthcoming becoming paradigmatic earthquake in anthropology, reuniting cultural and biological anthropology, and also, and I have to say this to some of my colleagues at least, a counterbalancing of radical constructivism, according to which no biology will ever top the discursive construction of reality. Finally, this is an invitation to join reflections on alternative ontologies to Descolas' naturalist dichotomic nature versus culture, nature versus nurture Western ontology, a neo-animist ontology, for example, as suggested in a recent article in Journal of Marketing Management by my good friend Eric Arnold in Consumer Behavior. Maybe we see such signs in the post-pandemic COVID-19 universe of consumption, at least in the Danish context. We are seeing emerging sort of searches for different kinds of consumer culture, different kinds of leisurely activities that are more slow, more respectful of our insertion in natural surroundings, an upsurge of certain kind of orientations and practices that seem to, but this is a hypothesis, that seem to build on a new understanding of the insertion of the consumer in a non-naturalist ontology, in a neo-animist ontology. And so this morning I was just phrasing a few terms that point to a new research project here at SDU, where we would like to explore such consumption practices as exemplar of neo-animist ontologies, be it slow processes, as already discussed in consumer research by our wonderful colleagues Jana Eckhart and Katrina Husemann. The pleasures of winter bathing, which has become a big thing in Denmark over the past few years, etc., etc. So these are some of the practices that we are going to explore in order to understand whether such neo-animist perspectives or ontologies may lie behind and underpin a gradual change in consumption practices. Gradual change that is urgently needed for solving some of the big issues that I was referring to. Thank you for your attention. I shall stop here. I have been speaking for much too long. I hope you didn't fall asleep, and I look forward to any questions and comments you might have.
Not at all. Sorry, no one's sleepy, I guess. Thank you very much for such interesting, provocative lecture. I think we have already some questions popping up, and I think actually we have 20 minutes, a little bit more, 22 minutes for discussions. So let's maybe start it right now. We have one question from Luciana Walter, or Walter. And she says, hi, Søren, Luciana Walter here. Thank you for the provocative thoughts. How has the international CCT community received these propositions? What are the reactions so far?
A few colleagues have written to me and said, really enjoyed this paper, highly provocative, really think that this is something that I need to consider, inspirational, but nothing much, right? So it appeared in RAM, and this is, of course, had it been JCR, I think there would have been considerably more response. So I need to do some PR activity for the paper. Our field works according to particular communicative and institutional logics that we all know about, and I really hope that I will share some of the similar thoughts at the presidential address I will give at the CCT conference, and maybe that will spark a little bit more interest in this. But I haven't had any negative feedback. So far, the feedback that I've had has been highly encouraging and positive, but not from a large group of people.
Very good. Let me then also, well, I need to translate this one from Elga Silva, Espigão. Professor Søren, thank you for bringing Edgar Morin for discussion about consumption. My question is, what type of methods should be used to guarantee or embrace the complexity proposed by Morin? It's also a question of mine, actually.
Yeah, this is obviously a very that's a big question, and the answer to it could fill a 3-volume methods book, I suppose. I shall try to do it very briefly. I think that we must, in order to respect these complexities, we must also adopt multi-method approaches. That is, embrace various experimental. Joseph Henrich's wonderful book on cultural evolutionism builds largely on experimental and anthropological research, and I find it excellent. Survey data, with all their caveats and limitations, will also provide something. Various types of biometric measurements, insights from hormonal processes, etc., combined with our ethnographic insights about the workings of culture. All of these must be mobilized, not in each and every research project. Obviously, that will be a too heavy task to accomplish for most, but insofar as we want to slowly, and I think we must also be patient here, there is no quick fix to this methodologically or theoretically. So slowly we must try to build such methods. I'm currently engaged in a very small biosocial research project on the process of eating with the hands, together with an Indian colleague, because of obviously this consumption practice is widespread in the Indian subcontinent, other places as well, but we have focused on India so far. Together with a cognitive psychologist who's interested in the sort of the more cognitive aspects. Yes.
So sorry, just to, can you show again the book that you just showed us, because we couldn't see it?
Yeah, it's called Joseph Henrich, The Secret of Our Success. It's a very nice book on cultural evolutionism, yeah, but has this tendency to highlight that cultural evolution makes us wonderfully bright and better adapted to survival, where Moang has this caveat that yeah, but it also makes us very stupid and subject to hybris, and we can see that in Russian war politics or similar things. They are not so smart, right? So our greatness comes also with madness, and I think Joseph Henrich has a tendency to forget that. Anyway, back to my answer to the question, so I can terminate that. So this is with a cognitive psychologist from Aarhus University interested in kind of more basic cognitive measurements and health effects of potential health effects of eating with the hands. The Indian colleague who's interested in sort of classical anthropological CCT-ish aspects of this particular cultural practice and how it sort of defines Indianness in a certain sense. And then my sort of more biosemiotic, I would like to at some point in time see if I could team up with a neural researcher or biologist to see if we could also measure some biosocial impacts of this practice. So this is so far my theoretical, but I hope also to be able to produce some empirical insight. So this is in a small scale one example of how to combine interests and perspective, the cognitive sort of rational health orientation kind of perspective, the cultural definition of Indianness through a particular type of consumption practice, and then the biosocial aspect of something that is at once a deeply embedded cultural practice and also something that is an intersected, embodied thing. Thank you for a very good question.
Meaning that we'll need more interdisciplinary research and engaging with other kinds of other types of researchers in other disciplines.
Not just on the methodological level, it's absolutely true that it also means that we need this on the theoretical level. And this is why I'm so happy to have been invited to join the Danish Institute of Advanced Study that you mentioned initially, because that is exactly a group of researchers at SDU representing all 5 faculties: engineering science, social science, humanities, and medical science, for increased possibilities and platforms for interdisciplinary research.
That's great. I have one more question from Maribel Suarez. Great to see you recovered. Thank you so much for bringing this timely discussion to our field. My question is, do you believe that body psychotherapists such as Stanley Kalman, formative psychology, or Alexander Lowen, bioenergetics, can serve as examples and maybe inspirational ways to think about the integration between the biological and the symbolic when thinking about human behavior?
Possibly so. I'm not familiar with any of these streams of research. I learned, and I write that in the paper, that I sort of started out with, I'm going to open a few doors here. And as soon as I started opening the door, I realized that I kicked open a very, very open door that a lot of much greater minds had since long. I, of course, was familiar with Moine, but I discovered the current tendencies in anthropology as I worked my way through it. And I'm very curious. I'm collecting research right now, particularly on biosemiotics, because that's kind of my first focus. But if you would share these colleagues and their work with me, I will respond in a mail once I have familiarized myself. Because obviously, I'm not saying this is a tricky issue, right? Because on the one hand, if you say anything, everything will bring particular enriching perspective. That means buying every single source wholesale, and that's probably neither feasible nor a platform to work from. So I think we should be very curious on the one hand all the time. So I am curious, but also critical. What are the caveats and what are sort of the limitations of these approaches? As Moine reminds us, we should always ask ourselves: are we opening up curious paths towards new insights, or are we establishing new dogma? And insofar as we establish new dogma, or there is an invitation in set sources to establish new dogma, I will be more skeptical. But that remains to be seen.
Yeah, that's interesting. Then I think it relates to another question. I mean, this idea of dogmas and everything. If we are opening up some doors, are we open up some dogmas or new troubles, let's say? So that's one question from Professor Francisco Vieira. And he asks, Professor Søren, thanks for sharing your knowledge with us. What you discussed in your presentation is very reminiscent of what was discussed at the Rio Eco 92 UN conference. A more ecocentric than anthropocentric thinking seems to be of interest to Europeans. Do you think that an appeal to studies in this sense can be considered a colonialist perspective? Thanks again for your presentation.
It can, except that it's interesting that also that a lot of the leading examples and thoughts within neo-animist perspectives seem to emerge from indigenous approaches to anthropological understandings of cultural processes and their inscription in particular natural environments. And I think that it's important for me, obviously, as a European. I think it's important to retain that for example, when Philippe Descola, who's obviously a French professor, speaking in just so many terms on behalf of a number of cultures, predominantly in the Brazilian, in the Amazon, other places as well. Yes, there is a colonialist element, but I also think that as scientists, so there is no objective. I mean, there's no hope for an objectivist portrayal of anything. As scientists, we need to focus more on the spoken than the speaker. And traditionally, we have focused on the speaker insofar as we have excluded voices from the global South, right? This was a serious mistake and error, something that haunts, by and large, all scientific disciplines. However, installing a regime where we say, okay, now we've had 200 years of colonialist domination, so now we will have we are entitled to 200 years of inverse post-colonialist domination. That's for me, that's not a viable path. I think that that we should be aware of the fact that we always, as I said, we always speak from an anthropocentric, but also from an ethnocentric, from a culturalocentric, from a disciplinocentric, from an individualocentric perspective. And there is nothing we can do about that, but that we must ourselves, as well as in the dialogue, be open to question, and this is exactly why we should refrain from install other new dogmas. We must question this perspective and say, this is what we can say and do from where we stand. And other people, wonderful colleagues, can say and do other things. And it's through that dialogue and this inclusiveness that we will gain Sophia, eco-Sophia, eco-wisdom.
Thank you, Søren. Well, we have another three other questions and one comment, and I think we can cover that within the remaining time, or if you can even like prolong a little bit, like 5 minutes. Let me know if you are up to, or I mean, I know that there is a match going on.
Yeah, the
audience.
You should know that Odense is playing the Danish Cup final today, and yeah, so I'm eager to know how that has ended. If
how is it going on?
It should be into prolongation if there's been prolongation. Anyway, questions.
Okay, questions. So it's from Professor Benjamin Rosenthal. Hi, Søren. Thanks for the presentation. What are interesting potential areas for empirical work on this new area? Social practices, emotions, what do you suggest?
I tried to provide a little list that was fairly broad, right? I think that there's just so many things that lend themselves. I mean, our relationship to food and the way that we are, and again this anthropological fact that food is always at the same time external and internal to us, and it's part of that interactivity with the environment is interesting domain, as also evidenced by my own interest in the eating with the hands. I think that issues concerning health and, for example, class differences in epigenetic constitutions of different health profiles and continued differences in health levels of healthiness in different social classes is, in many societies, in all societies, a very, very important domain of research, because even in the richest societies with in principle equal access to healthcare, et cetera, although of course there are certain insurance, even in the Danish sort of welfare state society, there are certain access to certain private insurances that will beef up a little bit, but by and large we all have access to a, for international standards, comparatively splendid healthcare system. Nevertheless, there is a life discrepancy of approximately 10 years between social classes, highest and lowest social classes. To what extent are these sheer outcomes of lifestyles, as some of the more sort of reductionist explanatory frameworks would have it? To what extent are they epigenetic? That is, outcomes not of our sort of individual choices of smoking too much, drinking too much, eating ourselves into obesity, et cetera, but outcomes of our sort of insertion in an environment that works on us epigenetically. So I think that's another, so a number of class dimensions also come into, important class dimensions also come into play here in for example, consumption, health and medical services, and food, and so on and so forth. Again, in order to sort of not to try to consider all dimensions, not in detail, but at least as part of the Umwelt, of the environmental ecosystemic surroundings that we live and survive in, hopefully.
And sorry, maybe a comment of mine, or based on all this, and also for Benjamin's question. So it's based on a research project that I'm currently working on with some co-authors. Well, so my question is, should we also, let's say, argue or maybe re-see our context that we're currently working on through this different lens? So for instance, you know that I'm working on pilgrimages and Catholic pilgrimages in Brazil and Europe. And so when I was doing my data collection in the north of Brazil, in the middle of the Amazon rainforest, I started to observe in this very massive processions across the city of Belém, the north of Brazil. Normally, you see millions of people walking on the streets, displaying or let's say, so they are basically doing this kind of rituals. And when they finish their rituals, all you can see is a lot of trash on the floor. So millions of bottles of or cups of plastic that they were drinking water are on the floor. So then they are producing some waste from that same ritual activity, spiritual activity. So I started to develop a project around that kind of paradox of people that are kind of having this transcendent experience, spiritual experience, with their heads in the clouds, but at the same time producing some waste to the mundane world and then to the other living beings. So should we also like use our own research contexts and try to re-see them in a different way, in different lens?
Well, as I usually say, paraphrasing an old Danish author who said about art, good art is always political. Political art is always bad. So good research is always politicizing. Politicizing research is always bad. So I think, I'm a little sharp here. I'm not sure that I can actually sort of defend this point of view 100%. But there's a truth to it. I think that, and I said initially, my invitation is not to replace anything and everything that we do with this perspective, because I think that there's lots of good CCT research out there that does not necessarily initially invite a biosocial constitution, and these transitions also won't happen overnight. But this is, of course, an invitation to, in an additional paper or additional perspective on the same data collection, try to understand, because what you talk about here, for me, is an obvious example of homo demens in a certain sense, right? That we are mad when we engage in ceremonies that sort of creates these transcendental spiritual experiences, that lifts us up, that enhances our existence, that creates communitas, that a feeling of that is much greater than just our pitiful little individual existences, something that is pivotal to our mental and social well-being. At the same time, in particular in a contemporary institutionalized market society, a fairly destructive event, as you point out, right? So how is this? How can we understand this? Also adding this maybe not the biosocial component, but insofar as it is homo demens at her best and worst in a certain sense.
That's great. We're about to go back to data collection, so that will be interesting for us to observe things. So we already, let's say this should be the end of our of your lecture, but then maybe let's go for one more question and then we finish. That's okay.
There is one more. Let's take that one as well.
Yeah. So that's from Adriana Schneider-Daloye. Thank you for the enlightening presentation. How do you suggest a researcher interested on starting a new research study with this interaction biology cultural perspective should start from? How do approach a new project with this perspective? More general question.
Yeah, I think I would encourage you to start in the library, because I don't think this is an easy. I don't, I've tried to familiarize myself a little bit, and I discovered that there's a lot to familiarize oneself with. I think that the first thing to do is to read a few key works, maybe by Philippe Descola, notably a number of publications, also a wonderful publication by Tim Ingold, and I think Gisli Paulsen is one of the co-editors. These are referred in the paper. I don't have a manuscript with me right here. On biosocial becomings, as it's called. Yeah, thank you, Jannsen. Because that gives a good overview of some of the anthropological reflections and some of the directions of anthropological research pointing into this type of research. There's another more sociological book. I failed to read. I think it's called Biosociality something. I think that's, or at least some of the chapters should be referred in the book as well, which also has indications of some of these research approaches. For example, in terms of investigations of social class and the biosocial epigenetic constitution of conditions for good or bad health in various social classes. Yes. So this is Tim Ingold and Gisli Paulsen's book, and then the other one. If you write me a mail directly, I will respond with the exact. If it's not, I fail to remember if it's referenced in the paper, but I will find it and send the reference to you. Yeah. So that goes for all of you, of course, out there. The 52 people with lots of stamina that are hanging on in there. Any additional source or a copy of the paper, please just write to me, and I will be happy to respond.
That's good. Sorry, Søren, there is one question left, and for us to be better beings or becomings, let's not have this person hanging here. So it's from Rodrigo Lopes. Professor Askegaard, first of all, thank you for such thought-provoking presentation. I was particularly interested by the part of your talk in which you mentioned research with female children. How challenging it was to apply the lens of biosociality,
yes.
Yeah, to such intersectional complex figures like girls.
Yeah, well,
challenging. Yeah,
I have to admit I have not investigated the literature on this issue. What I did was my colleague Danny Kjeldgaard referred me to a popular scientific program where there was a discussion of the paradox that women in the Scandinavian countries that are, according to most global surveys of life conditions and equal possibilities and opportunities, access to individualized career or life opportunities, etc., etc., more than women in other societies tend to choose what could be called traditional female employment careers. Employment careers that deal with human interaction in caring processes or in with some that deals with social interactivity rather than abstract mathematizing or engineering, etc., etc. In other words, when you are the freest, then you tend to there seems to be a tendency that the women will go for what is stereotypical female occupations. And why is that? And so, of course, there's a number of cultural explanations that can be mobilized to explain this, and that are mobilized in the dialogue or in the TV program. There was an interview, for example, with a social psychologist from Oxford University, Simon Baron Cohen. It's actually I think he's the brother of the comedian. So out of a family of at least well-known people, who says, and I'm not saying that you know that biology explains everything, because obviously this is a cultural trait, but I just think that my experiments with toddlers, et cetera, shows that there might be some biological orientation that you know, even female and male toddlers are not exactly the same when they, you know, crawl around at the age of 7 months, et cetera. And this is met with a response from a gender researcher who actually has her PhD from University of Southern Denmark, now works at the Metropolitan University of Oslo in Norway, who says, I don't see any place for biology in here. It's all a matter of parental influence that we have sort of inadvertently, the structurations, the hidden structurations and dominances that we cannot help but impose on our poor little children from the age of 1 day until they can finally be investigated in the period of when they're 7 months. And my problem with that was not so much that I said, well, she is right or wrong. My problem with the response was that there was no argument. It was an outright rejection of discussing the question. There was no reason to discuss biology because it did not play a role. End of story. And this is the kind of attitude that I've encountered also among ourselves, that you know, we can ridicule the reductionist paper by some of our experimental colleagues on, you know, hormonal influences on female consumer behavior in various situations during menstruative or non-menstruative periods, et cetera. But when we ridicule that, are we at the same? I think we at the same time tend to say hormonal influences on consumer behavior is baloney, and I think that's basically a wrong position to take. I think that hormonal influence on consumer behavior are absolutely crucial, but that they must be approached in a non-reductionist way. This is sort of the crux of the matter here.
That's very good. Thank you, Professor Søren. I loved your discussion during the paper on the homoness and everything else and how it is connected with reductionist somehow. Well, thank you very much. Let's stop
for
here.
Being here, all of you, and being patient with me.
Thank you for your time, for your very good provocative thoughts, and for being here. So I wish you a very good recovery and quick recovery, and that Odense will win today, the soccer match. I'd like to also to thank Deacon at FGV, Leticia, Vanessa, and Beatriz, and also the organizers of the event, Eliane, Marlon, Isabella, and Thaisa. Thank you all for organizing this panel, for inviting us, and also for organizing the whole conference. Thank you very much, everyone, for being here. And thank you again, Søren.
Thank you also from my side. And I hope that the whole event, not just this little incident, but that the whole event was and is and will be fruitful for organizers as well as participants. Thank you.
I'm sure we are all enlightened after this presentation.